The ballroom of Henry Whitaker's Malibu estate shimmered like a jewel box, its crystal chandeliers spilling golden light across the marble floor. The elite of Los Angeles swirled around him, movie moguls in tailored suits, tech barons with predatory smiles, and actresses draped in silk. Jazz floated through the air, a smooth undercurrent to the clink of champagne glasses and the murmur of calculated laughter. At 54, Henry stood apart, a lean silhouette in a black tuxedo, his silver-streaked hair catching the glow. He was the architect of this world, a billionaire CEO whose media empire shaped narratives and fortunes with surgical precision. Yet tonight, beneath his polished exterior, a shadow of restlessness stirred. He cradled a glass of scotch, the amber liquid a steadying weight as he watched the room. These were his peers, ambitious, ruthless, cloaked in civility. Then James Carver cut through the crowd, a lean figure with sharp eyes and sharper intent. At 56, James was Henry's oldest rival, a media magnate whose empire had clashed with Henry's for decades. Theirs was a game of chess played with headlines and hostile takeovers, but tonight James carried a spark of something new, something personal. "Whitaker," James said, his voice slicing through the music like a blade. He stopped a few feet away, swirling his drink, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Nice little kingdom you've got here, all shine, no substance." Henry's fingers tightened around his glass, but his face remained a fortress of calm. He'd mastered this dance, never let them see you bleed. "If you're here to critique my taste, Carver, I'll send you my decorator's number." The crowd nearby hushed, sensing the shift. James stepped closer, his voice dropping low, a barb wrapped in velvet. "It's not the decor I'm questioning. It's you. All this power, all this wealth. What's it worth if you're just a machine tallying profits? Tell me, Henry, when's the last time you risked something real? Put your honor on the table instead of hiding behind your checkbook?" The words struck deep, a challenge aimed at the man beneath the title. Henry felt the heat rise, a flicker of indignation, but he smothered it, his gray eyes locking onto James with icy resolve. "I don't need to prove myself to you, Carver. My life's work speaks louder than your cheap shots." "Does it?" James's smirk widened, his tone a taunt. "Then show us. Marry someone outside this gilded bubble, within a week. Prove you're more than a suit with a fortune. Or are you too scared to step off your pedestal?" A murmur rippled through the onlookers, a collective intake of breath. Henry's pulse surged, but he held it in check, his mind racing. This wasn't just a jab, it was a public dare, a trap baited with his own pride. To retreat would be weakness, to accept would be lunacy. Yet in the charged silence, a name surfaced like a whisper from the past. Ellen Harper. Ellen. 25 years ago, she'd been his anchor, a florist with gentle hands and a smile that softened the edges of his ambition. They'd met in a quiet coastal town, her laughter mingling with the crash of waves, her dreams small but fierce. He'd loved her once, until his family's expectations, a merger, a heiress, a legacy, pulled him away. He'd left her on a beach, her voice breaking against the wind, choosing power over promises. Now, James's challenge dragged her back, her memory sharp and unbidden, those hazel eyes, that quiet resolve. "I don't owe you an answer," Henry said, his voice low and firm, a blade of its own. "But I'll do it, my way. Watch me." James raised his glass, a mock salute. "1 week, Whitaker. Let's see if there's any honor left in you to wager." The crowd buzzed as James turned away, leaving Henry rooted to the spot. He drained his scotch, the burn grounding him, and slipped, a hand into his pocket. His fingers brushed an old photo. His mother, her stern gaze a silent anchor. She'd taught him dignity, not just dominance. What would she think of this game? He stepped onto the balcony, the cool night air a sharp contrast to the ballroom's heat. The Pacific stretched dark and vast below, its waves a restless murmur. Ellen. She was out there somewhere, beyond this world of glass and gold. He hadn't seen her since that day on the shore, hadn't dared to look back. But now, her name felt like a thread pulling at a knot he'd tied long ago. This was strategy, he told himself. A move to outmaneuver James and protect his reputation. He'd find Ellen, offer her a deal, money, stability, whatever she needed. It wasn't about emotion. It was about control. Yet as he gazed into the night, her voice echoed soft and pleading. "Don't go, Henry. We could be enough." He'd walked away then, burying her in the shadow of his success. Could he face her now? The jazz faded, replaced by the steady beat of his own heart. He wasn't the man she'd known. Not anymore. But James had thrown a gauntlet, and Henry Whitaker never flinched from a fight. He'd built his life on discipline, on mastery. This would be no different. He'd marry Ellen, silence the doubters, and walk away unscathed. That was the plan. Still, as he turned back to the glittering ballroom, a flicker of doubt crept in. What if Ellen wasn't the woman he'd left? What if this wasn't just a game? He pushed it aside, squaring his shoulders. Honor wasn't the prize here, victory was, and he'd claim it, no matter the cost. The ocean sighed below, indifferent to his resolve. Somewhere out there, Ellen waited, a memory he'd have to confront. Tomorrow, he'd find her. Tomorrow, he'd win. The rain pattered against the windows of Ellen Harper's flower shop, a quaint storefront nestled in Santa Monica's quieter streets. Inside, the air hummed with the scent of damp earth and blooming roses, a refuge of color against the gray dawn. Henry Whitaker stood at the entrance, his polished shoes flecked with water, the weight of his decision pressing like a stone in his chest. At 54, he was a man who ruled boardrooms, not small businesses. Yet here he was, chasing a past he'd buried to secure a win. Ellen emerged from behind a display of lilies, wiping her hands on a worn apron. At 49, she bore the marks of time, silver threads in her chestnut hair, fine lines framing her hazel eyes, but her presence carried a quiet strength that stopped him cold. She wasn't the fragile dreamer he'd left on that beach 25 years ago. She was something forged, unyielding. She met his gaze without a flicker of surprise, her silence a wall he couldn't breach. "Henry Whitaker," she said at last, her voice calm, carrying the faint lilt he'd once cherished. "What brings you back after all this time?" He adjusted, his tie, a habit to steady himself. "I need to talk, Ellen. It's a proposition. Business, not personal." Her lips tightened, but she nodded toward a wooden stool by the counter. "Business doesn't usually show up soaked from the rain. Sit." He did, the stool creaking under his weight, and launched into his offer with the precision of a dealmaker. "Marry me, for a week. A temporary arrangement. I'll pay you enough to keep this place afloat for a decade. It's a transaction, nothing more." Ellen's eyes narrowed, a flash of something, disdain perhaps, crossing her face. "A transaction," she repeated, folding her arms. "You think I'd trade my life for your money? You don't know me anymore, Henry." "It's not about you," he said, keeping his voice level, though her words pricked at him. "It's about a challenge. Someone dared me, and I don't." "Booze. You get stability. I get the upper hand. That's it." She turned away, picking up a pair of shears to trim a faded rose, her movements steady, deliberate. "Stability," she murmured. "I've built that myself, brick by brick. I don't need your handouts." He leaned forward, sensing her resistance but refusing to relent. "Then tell me what you want. Name it." She set the shears down, her hands still, her gaze piercing through him. "You think everything's for sale? Fine. Fund a children's charity, the one I've supported for years. Full commitment, no shortcuts. That's my price. Take it or leave it." Henry paused, caught off guard. A charity? It wasn't the demand he'd braced for, but it suited her. Stubborn, principled, a woman who'd rather give than take. He nodded, a faint respect stirring. "Agreed. One wedding, one donation. We have a deal?" Ellen's silence stretched, thick with the ghosts of their past, before she gave a sharp nod. "1 week, but don't expect me to bend beyond that." The pact was sealed, and by the next evening, Henry's world turned it into spectacle. The wedding unfolded at his Malibu estate, a stark contrast to Ellen's modest shop. Red lanterns hung across the garden, their glow softening the manicured lawn where guests, industry giants and curious onlookers, gathered in a haze of wealth. Henry stood at the center, impeccable in his tuxedo, his face a mask of composure. This was his triumph, his answer to James Carver's dare, a public proof of his resolve. Ellen arrived last, stepping into the lantern light in a simple white dress that seemed to defy the extravagance around her. No veil, no adornments, just her, raw and resolute. The crowd parted as she approached, her head high, her steps unhurried. She didn't smile, didn't falter, and when she reached Henry, her hazel eyes locked onto his with a quiet defiance that unsettled him. The officiant's voice droned through the vows, rings exchanged with mechanical precision. But Henry felt her presence more than the ritual. She wasn't here for him. She was here for something else, something he couldn't name. As the guests clapped, he caught her glance toward the lanterns, a fleeting tenderness breaking her guard. What did she see in those lights? The reception followed, a blur of champagne and hollow praise, but Ellen stood apart, a solitary figure by the garden's edge. Henry approached, his voice low. "You kept your word. The charity's funded. Documents are signed." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Good. That's what I asked for." "Is it?" He stepped closer, curiosity overriding his detachment. "You could have demanded more." "Why this?" Ellen turned to him, her expression a wall he couldn't climb. "Because some things matter more than wealth, Henry. You wouldn't get it. Not yet." Her words landed like a quiet rebuke, cutting deeper than he'd expected. He opened his mouth to counter, but she walked away, vanishing into the shadows of the lanterns. The crowd's chatter swallowed the moment, leaving him with a victory that rang empty. Inside, James Carver caught his eye from across the room, raising a glass with that maddening smirk. Henry mirrored the gesture, his jaw tight, but the satisfaction he'd sought slipped away. Ellen wasn't a piece in his chess game. She was a force he hadn't anticipated. He'd won the bet, yes, but the cost lingered unspoken. The lanterns glowed on, their light a silent witness to a man who'd thought he could buy his way to honor. Henry drained his glass, the scotch bitter on his tongue. This wasn't the end, and not by a long shot. The night draped Henry Whitaker's Malibu estate in a soft, velvety hush, the wedding reception's din fading into a distant murmur beyond the glass doors. The garden stretched out before him, quiet and shadowed, illuminated only by the warm red glow of lanterns swaying gently between the oaks. Henry stood on the terrace, his untouched scotch a cold weight in his hand, the ocean's whisper a steady rhythm against the stillness. At 54, he'd orchestrated this night to perfection, a calculated win over James Carver's dare. Yet the triumph felt brittle, crumbling under a restlessness he couldn't name. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Ellen Harper stood alone in the garden, her white dress a stark silhouette against the lantern light. She knelt by a small table, her hands moving with a purpose he couldn't discern. Something tugged at him. Curiosity, perhaps, or the echo of her words earlier. Some things matter more than wealth. Setting the glass on the railing, he stepped into the night, the damp grass soaking through his polished shoes as he approached. The air carried the scent of earth and roses, a faint breeze rustling the leaves overhead. Ellen didn't look up as he neared. She struck a match, its flare casting a glow across her face, lines etched by years he'd missed, hazel eyes fixed on her task with a quiet reverence. She lit a single red lantern, smaller than the others, its light pooling around her like a halo. Only then did she glance at him, her expression guarded, unyielding. "What are you doing?" Henry asked, his voice softer than he'd meant, disarmed by the intimacy of the scene. Ellen stood, brushing her hands against her dress, the lantern's glow dancing in her eyes. "I do this every year," she said, her tone even, deliberate, "to remember Clara." Clara? The name landed like a stone, unfamiliar yet heavy with implication. He stepped closer, the space between them thickening. "Who's Clara?" She held his gaze unwavering, and for the first time since he'd walked into her flower shop, a crack appeared in her armor, a shimmer of grief, swiftly masked. Our daughter, Henry. She was ours. The words hit him like a wave, crashing through the walls he'd built. His breath snagged, the ground shifting beneath him, but he forced himself to stay upright, his hands clenching at his sides. Our daughter? His voice rasped, disbelief tangling with a rising dread. What are you talking about? Ellen's lips pressed into a thin line, then parted as she spoke. Her words measured, each one a weight dropped into the silence. 25 years ago, when you left me on that beach, I was pregnant. Clara was born 9 months later. She lived 5 years, 5 years of hospital rooms and fragile hope, before her heart failed. I buried her alone. Henry's mind reeled, yanking him back to that windswept shore. The salt air had stung his face as Ellen clutched his arm, her voice breaking against the gale. Don't go, Henry. We could be enough. He'd thought it was a plea to tether him, a desperate grasp at a life he couldn't afford, not with his family's expectations looming, a heiress waiting, a legacy to secure. He'd turned away, her sobs lost to the waves, choosing ambition over her. Now the truth clawed at him. She'd been pleading for more than herself. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his tone sharpening despite his effort to keep it steady. Anger flared, but he crushed it down. Control was his shield, and he wouldn't let it falter. Ellen's eyes flashed, a spark of defiance igniting. I tried. That day, I wanted you to know. But you didn't hear me. You walked away, chose your world over mine. After that, what was the point? You weren't there when I needed you. Why would I beg you to care? Her words sliced through him, sharper than any boardroom rebuke, stripping away the pride he'd worn like armor. He saw her on that beach again, her tears, her trembling hands, and how he'd dismissed them as frailty. Now they framed a reality he couldn't escape, a child he'd never known, a life he'd forsaken. His chest tightened, but he held his ground, his voice low, strained. I didn't know, Ellen. I swear I didn't. She turned back to the lantern, her fingers tracing its edge with a tenderness that cut deeper than her words. Maybe not. But you chose ignorance. I raised her, Henry. I held her through the fevers, whispered stories when she couldn't sleep. She asked about you. Where's Daddy? And I lied. I said you were far away, doing big things. It was kinder than the truth. The image burned into him, a little girl with Ellen's eyes, waiting for a father who never came. He wanted to argue, to defend the man he'd been, but the words stuck, heavy and useless. Control wavered, just for a breath, and he pressed, a hand to his temple, anchoring himself. What was she like? He asked, the question slipping out, raw and unguarded. Ellen's gaze softened, a memory flickering through her resolve. She was gentle, loved flowers, always picking them, even the dandelions. She had your stubbornness, though, fought every day she had. He nodded, the weight sinking into his marrow. Stubbornness, his mark, carried by a daughter lost to him. The lantern glowed between them, a silent testament to the years he couldn't reclaim. I'm sorry, he said, the words rough, inadequate. I didn't know. Ellen didn't reply, her eyes on the flame. Then she stepped back, her voice firm again. You've got your wedding, Henry. You won your bet. But this? She nodded to the lantern. This isn't yours to touch. She walked away, leaving him in the circle of light, the ocean's sigh filling the void. He stared at the lantern, its glow a quiet accusation against the man he'd become. James's challenge had been a spark. This was the blaze. Honor, he'd thought, was about winning. Now it felt like a debt he'd never repay. The morning sun streamed through the towering windows of Henry Whitaker's Los Angeles office, a sleek sanctuary of glass and steel high above the city's sprawl. At 54, he sat behind his mahogany desk, surrounded by plaques and framed headlines that mapped his ascent to billionaire CEO, a titan of media who shaped the world's stories. Today, though, the air felt thick, the silence pierced by the low drone of the television on the wall. Its screen flared with a headline that twisted his stomach. Whitaker's wedding. Love or leverage? Henry leaned back, his fingers steepled, his gray eyes locked on the broadcast. A reporter's voice cut through the room, crisp and unyielding. Insiders allege Henry Whitaker's sudden marriage to Ellen Harper, a local florist, was a strategic play to win a bet with rival James Carver. Is this a billionaire's gambit, or a rare glimpse of heart from the media mogul? The words stung, each one a needle pricking at his carefully guarded pride. He'd braced for attention, his life invited it. But this was a public autopsy, stripping bare a choice he hadn't fully reckoned with. Clara's existence, unveiled under the lantern's glow the night before, still reverberated in his chest, a wound too raw to touch. Now the press painted him as a calculating puppet master, Ellen as a prop. He clenched his jaw, forcing the heat in his veins to cool. Control was his bedrock. He wouldn't let it crumble. His assistant, Clara, unrelated to the daughter he'd just learned of, buzzed through the intercom, her tone brisk. "Mr. Whitaker, the lines are flooded. Reporters want a response. What do I say?" "Nothing," he replied, his voice steady, resolute. "Let them spin their tales. I don't answer to them." He muted the TV, but the images lingered, grainy. Shots of Ellen at the wedding, her white dress stark against the lanterns, her face a shield of quiet strength. Then James Carver flickered onto the screen, filmed outside his own glassy headquarters, his sharp features framed by a tailored coat. The reporter thrust a microphone forward, and Henry braced himself. "Mr. Carver, any thoughts on Whitaker's marriage?" the reporter pressed. James's lips curled into that familiar smirk, his eyes glinting with deliberate intent. "Henry's always been a man of strategy," he said, his voice smooth as a blade. "But strategy doesn't build a wife, a man who'd walk away from his own. What does that say about his honor?" The accusation landed like a blow, public and precise. Henry's hand gripped the armrest, but he didn't flinch. James knew. Somehow, he knew about Clara, or enough to wield it like a weapon. The words echoed Ellen's in the garden. "You chose not to know." Had she confided in him? Had James been there when Henry wasn't? His mind churned, but he kept his breath even, his face a mask. He wouldn't give James the satisfaction of a crack. He stood, pacing to the window, the city sprawling below like a game board he'd conquered. The press didn't have the whole truth, not yet. But James's hint was gasoline on the fire. Honor. The word gnawed at him, no longer a prize to flaunt but a lens exposing a man he barely recognized. He'd forged his life on discipline, on rising above provocation, yet this cut deeper. This wasn't just about a bet anymore. The door opened, and Clara stepped in, a stack of newspapers in her arms. "It's everywhere, sir," she said, setting them on the desk. "Wall Street Journal, LA Times, even the rags. They're calling it the billionaire's bluff." "What's the plan?" Henry glanced at the headlines. "Whitaker's mystery wife, pawn or partner," and turned away, his voice calm but firm. "No plan. They'll burn out eventually. They always do." Clara lingered, then nodded and left. Alone again, he picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over Ellen's number. He needed clarity. About Clara, about James, about the years he'd missed. The call rang twice before her voice came through, cool and unyielding. "Henry," she said. No greeting, no softness. "What is it?" He kept his tone even, though the questions simmered. "The press is tearing into us. They're calling it a sham. James is stirring it up. He hinted at something personal. Did you tell him about Clara?" A pause, then Ellen's reply, sharp and steady. "No. I don't share my life with him, and I don't owe you my secrets. If he knows, he pieced it together. I've faced worse than gossip." Her resolve jabbed at him, but he didn't press. "They're dragging you through this too, Ellen. I can stop it, release a statement, kill the story." "Don't," she snapped, her voice rising just enough to cut. "I don't need your shield, Henry. I've stood tall through harder days than this. Let them talk." The line clicked dead, leaving him with the sting of her defiance. He set the phone down, staring at the muted TV where James's smirk lingered, a silent goad. Anger flickered, but he breathed it away, his hands steady. He wouldn't. Snap. Not at James, not at the press. That wasn't his way. Mastery was his strength, and he'd wield it now. He returned to his desk, pulling a notepad from the drawer. If the world wanted a narrative, he'd shape it, not with words, but with deeds. Ellen's refusal to bend, her quiet fortitude, gnawed at his conscience. Clara's ghost hovered, a daughter he'd failed without knowing. James's barb wasn't just a taunt, it was a reflection, and Henry hated the image it cast. The city thrummed below, blind to the battle within him. He'd married Ellen to win a dare, to guard his pride, but pride wasn't honor. Honor was something deeper, something he'd lost in the climb. The spotlight blazed, but he wouldn't buckle, not now. Not when the stakes had shifted beyond his own name. He jotted a note. See Ellen. Ask about Clara. No more bets. And tucked it into his pocket. The pressure mounted, but he'd face it standing firm. Whatever lay ahead, he'd meet it with the dignity he was only beginning to grasp. The restaurant hummed with understated luxury, its amber lights casting a warm sheen across the polished oak tables. Henry Whitaker sat across from James Carver, the soft clatter of silverware and the murmur of jazz weaving through the tension between them. At 54, Henry was a study in discipline, his tuxedo pristine, his gray eyes steady despite the turmoil roiling beneath. James, 56, leaned back with the casual air of a man who'd mastered provocation, his sharp features softened by the glow, but his smirk hinted at the edge Henry knew too well. This wasn't a peace offering. It was a confrontation. Henry had requested the meeting, driven by Ellen's reticence and the press's unrelenting storm. James's televised barb, a man who'd walk away from his own, had lodged in his mind like a shard of glass, cutting deeper with each replay. He needed the truth, and if Ellen wouldn't yield it, James would. The waiter poured wine, a rich crimson that gleamed in the glass, but Henry left it untouched, his hands clasped. On the table, a signal of restraint. You've been enjoying yourself, Carver, Henry said, his voice low, controlled. Fanning the flames, feeding the headlines? What's your game? James tilted his glass, his eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and intent. My game? I'm just an observer, Henry. You're the one who turned a dare into a spectacle. Marrying Ellen Harper. Clever, if a bit dramatic. Did you think it'd stay under wraps? Henry's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone even. You said something on air. About me abandoning someone. You've got a point to make, so make it. What do you know? James set his glass down, the smirk fading into something sterner, more deliberate. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You're still in the dark, aren't you? Ellen didn't spill it all under those lanterns. I thought she'd have told you by now. Henry's pulse quickened, but he held his ground, his face a fortress of calm. Told me what? James studied him, as if gauging the cost of the revelation. Then he spoke, his words slow and piercing. Clara, your daughter. I knew her, Henry. I was there when you weren't. The name crashed through him, a jolt that echoed the shock of Ellen's confession in the garden. Clara. That wound was still fresh, and now James was twisting it open. He gripped the table's edge, his knuckles whitening, but he forced his breath to steady, his voice a low rasp. You knew her? How? James's gaze held steady, but a flicker of something, grief perhaps, crossed his face, unguarded for a moment. Years back, after you walked away from Ellen, I crossed paths with her at a hospital. She was worn thin, holding a little girl, your little girl. Clara had a heart defect, needed treatments Ellen couldn't always cover. I stepped in, paid for some of them. Not out of nobility. I cared about Ellen. Still do. Henry's mind staggered, conjuring images he couldn't shake. Ellen alone in a sterile room, a child, his child, fighting for breath, and James of all people standing in his stead. He wanted to snap, to demand why Ellen had kept this from him, but he swallowed the impulse, his discipline a tether. "You cared about her," he echoed, his tone flat, probing. "Enough to play the hero while I was gone?" James's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Don't cast yourself as the bad guy, Henry. I wasn't her rescuer. I was just there. Ellen didn't ask. I offered. She'd sit by Clara's bed, night after night, never breaking. That's a woman with more dignity than either of us can touch." The words carved into him, each one a reflection of his absence. He saw Ellen on that beach, her pleas drowned by the wind, her strength under the lantern, and now this. A life he'd never known, touched by a rival's quiet compassion. His chest constricted, but he kept his voice level, his eyes fixed on James. "Why tell me now? To rub it in?" James shook his head, leaning back with a sigh. "Not to rub it in. To wake you up. That dare at the gala? It wasn't about breaking you, it was about shaking you. You've built a fortress, Henry, but what's it worth if you don't face what's outside? Ellen's not a trophy to flaunt. She's a truth you've sidestepped too long." Henry stared at him, the jazz receding to a faint pulse. James wasn't just a rival. He was a mirror, reflecting a man Henry might have been. The twist sliced deeper than any taunt. James hadn't been the adversary all along, but a witness to Henry's failures. Anger flared, then faded, leaving a hollow pang. He'd left Ellen to struggle, left Clara to fade, and James had stepped into the gap, not perfectly, not selflessly, but enough to matter. "I didn't know," Henry said at last, the admission rough, unguarded. "Not until she told me about Clara. I don't want your sympathy, Carver, and I'm not here to spar with you." James nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. "Then don't spar. Face it. Ellen's worth more than your pride. Show you've got some honor left, not for me, but for her." The waiter returned, shattering the moment, but Henry barely registered it. James stood, tossing a bill on the table, his parting words hanging in the air. "You've got a week to sort it out, Whitaker. Time's running." Henry sat alone, the restaurant's warmth a stark contrast to the chill settling in his core. James's truth wasn't just a revelation. It was a call, one that demanded more than a wedding or a victory. Honor wasn't a shield to brandish, it was a debt to settle. He thought of Ellen, her unyielding grace, and Clara, a daughter lost to his ambition. The spotlight burned hotter now, but he wouldn't bend. Not yet. He rose, squaring his shoulders. Whatever lay ahead, he'd meet it with the dignity he was only beginning to reclaim. The rain fell in heavy sheets over Santa Monica, drumming a relentless beat against the roof of Ellen Harper's flower shop. Henry Whitaker stood outside, his overcoat soaked through, the dim streetlights casting a sheen across his silver-streaked hair. At 54, he was a man accustomed to commanding glass towers, not standing vulnerable in a downpour. Yet here, he was, driven by a need he could no longer ignore. Clara's existence, James's revelations, and Ellen's quiet strength had unraveled the threads of his control, and tonight he sought answers, not as a victor, but as a man. He pushed open the door, the bell jingling faintly above the storm's roar. The shop was a haven of muted colors, roses drooping under the weight of moisture, the air thick with the scent of wet earth. Ellen stood behind the counter, her apron dusted with soil, her hazel eyes lifting to meet his. She didn't flinch at his presence, didn't soften. She simply watched, her silence a fortress he'd once mistaken for weakness. "Ellen," he said, his voice rough from the rain and the weight of his purpose. "We need to talk." She set down a pair of shears, her hands steady despite the tension in the air. "You've got your wedding, Henry. Your bet's won. What's left to say?" He stepped closer, water dripping onto the worn wooden floor, his hands clutching a small weathered notebook, Clara's, the one she'd given him in the garden. "This," he said, holding it up, his tone firm but restrained. "Clara, I need to know more. James told me he was there. Helped you when?" "I didn't. I'm not here to argue. I need to understand." Ellen's gaze flickered to the notebook, then back to him, a shadow of pain crossing her face before she masked it. "Understand?" she echoed, her voice low, cutting. "You weren't there to understand, Henry. You left. What's there to know now?" The words stung, but he didn't recoil. He set the notebook on the counter, his fingers lingering on its cover, and took a breath to steady himself. "I left because I thought I had to. Family, expectations, a life I was told to build. I didn't know about her. I'm not excusing it, but I'm asking. Tell me about Clara." Ellen's hands stilled, her eyes searching his, testing, weighing. Then she turned away, walking to a small table where a single red lantern sat, unlit. She struck a match, the flame flaring briefly before settling into a soft glow. "She loved these," she said, her voice softening, though it carried an edge of steel. "Clara. She'd sit by the window, watching the lights, asking me to make them dance. She was small, too small, but she had a spirit that wouldn't quit." Henry listened, his chest tightening as her words painted a picture he'd never seen. He stayed silent, his discipline holding him steady, letting her lead. "She got sick early," Ellen continued, her gaze fixed on the lantern. "A heart defect, something the doctors couldn't fix, only delay. I worked every hour I could, sold what I had, to keep her with me. She'd smile through it. God, that smile. Like yours sometimes, when you'd let your guard down." The comparison pierced him, a thread of connection to a child he'd never held. He wanted to look away, to shield himself from the ache, but he didn't. "What happened?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ellen's fingers tightened around the matchbox, her voice dropping to a raw hush. "She fought for 5 years. The last night she was in my arms in a hospital bed that smelled of bleach. She couldn't breathe right, but she looked at me and said, 'Don't cry, Mommy.' She was gone by morning. I buried her under a tree. She loved a little oak by the coast." The image seared into him. Ellen alone, cradling their daughter, a grave beneath an oak. His throat closed, but he swallowed it down, his hands clenching at his sides. "I should have been there," he said, the admission rough, unguarded. "I'm sorry, Ellen, for all of it." She turned to him then, her eyes blazing with a mix of grief and defiance. "Sorry doesn't bring her back, Henry. It doesn't erase the nights I sat alone, wondering if you'd ever care. James helped, he paid for medicine when I couldn't, but he wasn't her father. You were. And you weren't there." The truth landed like a blow, but he took it, standing tall despite the weight. "I know," he said, his voice steady, though it cracked at the edges. "I can't change that, but I'm here now. Tell me what I can do, for her, for you." Ellen's lips pressed tight, her gaze piercing through him. "You don't get to fix this with money or promises. Clara's gone. If you want to honor her, prove you're worth something more than your name. Not to James, not to me. To her memory, that's all I'll ask." Her words hung between them, a challenge heavier than any dare. The rain pounded harder, a drum roll, against the roof, but Henry didn't flinch. He nodded, slow and deliberate, his hands unclenching. "I will," he said, his tone firm, resolute. "Not because of a bet, but because I owe her that." Ellen didn't respond, her eyes returning to the lantern, its light flickering in the dimness. She stepped back, leaving him with the glow and the weight of her words. He picked up the notebook, its pages a lifeline to a daughter he'd lost, and turned to leave. The rain greeted him like a penance, cold and unyielding, but he welcomed it. Outside, the storm blurred the world, but his mind was clear. James had pushed him, Ellen had stripped him bare, and Clara had changed him. Honor wasn't a trophy to win, it was a promise to keep. He'd spent his life mastering control, but this was different. This was about standing in the rain, facing the man he'd been, and choosing to be more. The lantern's light faded behind him, but its warmth lingered, a quiet call to the dignity he'd only begun to seek. The garden of Henry Whitaker's Malibu estate glowed with a sea of red lanterns, their light swaying like embers against the cool night sky. At 54, Henry stood at its heart, his tuxedo traded for a simple black sweater, his silver-streaked hair catching the flicker of flames. The air carried the scent of salt from the nearby Pacific, mingling with the faint perfume of roses, a tribute to Ellen Harper's world, brought into his own. Tonight wasn't about power or prestige, it was about Clara, and the man he was becoming because of her. Guests filled the space, a quieter crowd than the wedding. Colleagues, a few reporters, and James Carver among them, but their presence felt secondary. Henry had organized this night in the week since standing in Ellen's rain-soaked shop, driven by her challenge. Prove you're worth something more than your name, to her memory. He'd spent days planning, nights wrestling with the weight of it, until the idea took root, a memorial for Clara, a public reckoning of his past. Ellen stood near the edge, her white dress replaced by a gray coat, her hazel eyes fixed on the lanterns. She hadn't spoken to him since that night in the rain, but she'd come, her presence a silent assent. Henry stepped forward, a microphone in hand, the hum of anticipation settling over the crowd. He cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "Thank you for being here," he began, his tone low, deliberate. "This isn't a gala or a press event. It's a night for Clara, my daughter. A girl I never knew, but who changed me more than any deal or headline ever could." The words hung in the air, raw and unguarded. He felt the eyes on him. James's sharp gaze, the reporter's pens poised, but he pressed on, his discipline a lifeline. 25 years ago, I walked away from Ellen Harper, chose ambition over love. I didn't know she was pregnant. Clara lived 5 years, fought a battle I never saw, and died while I built an empire. I failed her. That's the truth. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but he didn't pause. I married Ellen a week ago to win a bet. A dare from James Carver. I thought it was about pride. It wasn't. It was about waking up. Tonight I'm doing what I should have done years ago, honoring Clara, not with words, but with action. He turned to a table where a single lantern burned brighter, its light steady. I've signed over a major contract, a deal worth millions, to fund a children's charity in Clara's name. It's not a gesture, it's a commitment. Ellen asked me to prove I'm more than my name. This is my start. The crowd stirred, whispers turning to gasps, but Henry's focus shifted to Ellen. Her eyes met his, wide with something he couldn't name, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. He stepped back, gesturing to her. "Ellen, this is yours too. Say what you need to." She hesitated, then moved forward, her steps measured, her coat brushing the grass. She took the microphone, her voice soft but firm, cutting through the night. Clara loved lanterns, loved light. She'd be happy to see this. I didn't expect Henry to do it, but maybe she'd be proud. Her words were simple, unguarded, and they struck him deeper than any applause. She handed the microphone back, retreating to the lanterns, her silence a gift he hadn't earned. The crowd clapped, but Henry's gaze drifted to James, standing near the back, his smirk replaced by a nod, a rare sign of respect. Henry approached him, the noise fading, as they faced each other. "You pushed me into this," he said, his tone even, not accusing. "Why?" James shrugged, his sharp eyes softening. "I told you. It wasn't about breaking you. I saw Ellen struggle, saw Clara fade. I lost a son years ago. Car accident. I couldn't save him, but I could help her. You needed to see what you'd missed. Looks like you did." The confession landed quietly, a bridge between rivals. Henry nodded, his voice low. "You were there when I wasn't. I don't like you for it, but I owe you." James's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Don't owe me. Just don't waste." He walked away, leaving Henry with the weight of a shared loss. The night pressed on, guests mingling, lanterns casting their glow, but Henry found Ellen by the oak at the garden's edge. She stood alone, her fingers tracing the bark, her breath visible in the cool air. "You didn't have to do this," she said as he approached, her voice steady but softer. "The charity, the speech, all of it. I did, he replied, standing beside her, his hands in his pockets. Not for James, not for them, for Clara. And you. I thought honor was about winning. It's not. It's about this. Facing what I ran from. Ellen turned to him, her hazel eyes searching his, a flicker of something new breaking through her guard. Trust, maybe, or forgiveness. Clara would have liked you, she said, almost a whisper. She forgave easy. The words settled into him, a balm against the bit ache. He didn't respond, just stood with her, the lanterns ablaze behind them. The crowd thinned, the night deepening, but they remained, two figures under the oak, bound by a daughter neither could reclaim. Henry felt the shift within him, subtle but seismic. He'd spent his life chasing control, mastering every challenge, but this was different. This was surrender, not to defeat, but to something greater. The contract was gone, his pride humbled, yet he stood taller than he ever had. Honor wasn't a crown to wear, it was a burden to carry, and he'd bear it now, for Clara. The ocean sighed below, a steady rhythm against the silence. The lanterns burned on, their light a testament to a man who'd finally stopped running. The first light of dawn crept over Santa Monica, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. Henry Whitaker stood outside Ellen Harper's flower shop, his breath visible in the crisp morning air, his hands tucked into the pockets of a worn jacket. At 54, he'd traded the trappings of his billionaire life, the tailored suits, the gleaming office, for something simpler, something real. The shop's windows glowed faintly, the scent of roses and damp soil drifting through the cracked open door. This wasn't his world, but it was hers. And now, it was where he belonged. Inside, Ellen moved with quiet purpose, arranging a bouquet of daisies on the counter. Her chestnut hair, streaked with silver, caught the light, and her hazel eyes lifted as Henry stepped in, the bell jingling softly. She didn't smile, didn't pause, but there was a shift in her, a softening, an acknowledgement of the man who'd stood with her under the lanterns the night before. "Morning," Henry said, his voice low, steady, carrying the weight of the week that had changed him. "Thought I'd stop by." Ellen nodded, her hands deftly trimming a stem. "You're up early for a man who gave away a fortune last night." He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Couldn't sleep. Too much to think about." The memorial had been a turning point. Clara's name etched into a legacy of hope, the contract sacrificed to fund a charity that would help children like her. The press had spun it into headlines, Whitaker's redemption, but Henry cared little for their words. What mattered was Ellen's quiet, she'd be proud, and the way James Carver had stepped back, leaving him to this new path. He'd spent his life chasing control, but now, standing in this shop, he felt a different strength, a dignity earned, not demanded. Ellen set the shears down, wiping her hands on her apron. "You meant it, didn't you? The charity, all of it, every word," he said, meeting her gaze. "It's not about the bet anymore or James. It's about Clara and you. I owed her that much." She studied him, her eyes searching for the man she'd once known beneath the one he'd become. Then she turned, pulling a small red lantern from a shelf, its surface scuffed from years of use. "This was hers," she said, her voice soft but firm. She'd hold it when she couldn't sleep. "I kept it lit for her, every night after she was gone." Henry took it, his fingers brushing the worn metal, the weight of it grounding him. "She was yours," he said, his tone rough with emotion. "But she was mine too. I didn't know her, but I feel her now." Ellen's lips pressed tight, a flicker of something. Grief, acceptance, crossing her face. "She'd have liked you, Henry." She saw the good in people, even when they didn't. The words settled into him, a quiet absolution he hadn't sought but needed. He set the lantern on the counter, his hands steady. "I'm not going back," he said, the decision spilling out, firm and final. "The office, the deals. I'm done. I want to be here, with you, if you'll have me." Not to fix the past, but to live what's left. Ellen's breath caught, her eyes widening briefly before narrowing with caution. You don't know this life. Flowers, quiet days. It's not your world. It wasn't, he agreed, stepping closer. But it's where I found what matters. I spent years running, Ellen. I'm tired of it. Let me stay. She didn't answer at first, her hands resting on the counter, her silence a test he couldn't rush. Then she nodded, a single deliberate motion. All right, but it's not easy. You'll have to learn. Flowers don't bow to you like boardrooms do. He chuckled, the sound low and genuine. I'll manage. I've got a good teacher. The morning unfolded in small, steady steps. Henry shed his jacket, rolling up his sleeves as Ellen showed him how to trim stems, her instructions sharp but patient. His hands fumbled at first, the shears awkward in his grip, but she didn't laugh, only corrected, her presence a quiet anchor. They worked in tandem, the shop filling with the rustle of petals and the hum of a new rhythm. Later they stepped outside, the sun climbing higher, warming the damp earth. Ellen handed him a match, gesturing to the lantern. Light it, she said. For her. He struck it, the flame flaring briefly before settling into a steady glow. Together, they hung it above the shop's door, its light a beacon against the dawn. To Clara, he said, his voice firm, a vow. To Clara, Ellen echoed, her tone softer, a shared promise. They stood there, side by side, the world waking around them, cars rumbling past, birds stirring in the trees. Henry felt the shift, subtle but profound. He'd given up millions, walked away from power, yet he'd gained something greater, a life rooted in honor, not headlines. The charity bore Clara's name, helping children he'd never meet, a legacy born of loss but built on hope. Ellen glanced at him, her hazel eyes catching the light. You're different, she said, not a question but an observation. I hope so, he replied, his voice steady. I've spent too long being the man I thought I had to be. This feels right. She didn't reply, but her hand brushed his briefly, a gesture small but weighty. They returned inside, the day stretching ahead, simple and unglamorous. Henry knew the road wouldn't be easy. Doubts would linger, the past would echo. But he'd face it, not with force, but with the quiet strength he'd found in Ellen's world. The lantern swayed above, its light a reminder of a daughter lost, and a life reclaimed. Henry Whitaker, once a titan of wealth, stood now as a man of dignity, flawed, humbled, but whole. The dawn broke fully, and with it, a peace he'd never known.